Hello, and a warm welcome to everyone. If you're just joining us, some housekeeping notes before we begin. We'll be taking as many audience questions as possible, and you can submit those questions in the chat box on the right of your screen. Once the session ends, you'll be able to find the next sessions by scrolling down on your screen. In any case, if you have to leave the session at any point, these sessions are recorded and will be available here on the same website later. And we'd like to encourage everyone to join the discussion on social media with the hashtags Women4Inclusion, hashtag WFG7, and hashtag Women4CLIMATE. So to begin, I'd like to welcome Stephanie Foster, partner at Smash Strategies, to lead the session. Stephanie has a wide-ranging experience in government, policy, and law, and advises organizations on achieving results for gender equality and for women's leadership. Stephanie, please.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today with all of you and to really lead this discussion on such a critical issue, how to really think about inclusive action to address climate change. As we know, like COVID-19, climate has a disproportionate impact on women. 80% of climate refugees are women, and women and children are 14 times more likely to die than men as a result of a natural disaster. Why is that? Women are poorer than men. We have less access to power and resources, and as a result, often have a harder time coping with the shocks that come from these types of crises. But we also know that as we confront crises like COVID, like climate, that women are more than victims. They're agents of change. And they are drivers of change, they're leaders of change, developing solutions, and taking action. We met two such leaders this morning in the opening session, Alexandria Villaseñor and Clover Hogan. And so we hope that those of us in this session can be adult allies, as they said, to their work to really address climate change. But we know four things about women and climate that I want to point out just before we start. We know that countries that have more women parliamentarians are much more likely to ratify environmental treaties. We know that corporations that have more women on boards are more likely to have environmental and sustainability policies. We know that women individually are much more likely to take action to address climate. They're much more likely to see the need for individual action and are willing to change their behavior. And we also know that women are, and girls are key stewards to sustainable resource management, as they're on the front lines and see the impact of climate change every day. So this is indeed a moment for us to really bring together the importance of gender equality and sustainability. This is a pivotal moment. So this panel is really going to look at a very high level at how we do just that, how we bring together both climate and gender equality, and what we ask of the G7 leaders when they meet in June in the Leaders Summit, whether that's virtual or in person. And so to answer really the questions that I'm going to pose, and I know all of you are going to send in through the chat, I have three really amazing panelists who come from different backgrounds, but have really been leaders in terms of sustainability and gender. And I'll just introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to pose one question to all of them to kick off the panel. We have Virginie Elias, the Chief Sustainability Officer of P&G, Chris McGrath, Vice President and Chief of Global Impact, Sustainability and Wellbeing at Mondelez, and Natalie Molina-Nino, CEO of O Cubed and the author of Leapfrog, the New Revolution for Women Entrepreneurs. So I want to thank them all for joining us here today. And I'm going to start with, again, one general question. I'll start with Virginie and then go to Chris and Natalie with this question. Obviously, COVID has magnified everything, but it's reinforced what we know about this incredible link and importance of seeing women as more than victims, and understanding women's leadership is critical to addressing climate change and sustainability. We know we need a new way of solving problems, and we need to engage women at every level. So really the question to each of you is, how do you see your company or your sector really playing a role a leadership role in addressing this key intersection of issues? So Virginie, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'd like to start with an example on how system change innovation on climate plays out for our company. And maybe start by reminding ourselves that our greatest carbon footprint for P&G is actually the water and the energy that is needed to use our product. You know, whether you wash your hair or you shave or you do your dishes or your laundry, this is where the carbon footprint is. And one of our triggers for system change innovation happened for us 3 years ago when there was the massive drought in Cape Town. You know, there was a looming day zero, the day where there is no water at the tap. And in the end, day zero did not happen because the municipality put in place very strict water restriction, 50 liters per person per day. And so when we send our teams down there to understand what it meant to live on 50 liters per person per day, most of us use at least 100 liters. Many Americans use 500 liters. Your 8-minute shower this morning was 80 liters of water. So with 50 liters of water, the water in the home gets reused from one job to another and more contaminated. So when we met women, for instance, who said they had beautiful long hair, they had to cut their hair because you cannot wash and rinse your hair with 50 liters. So not really the good life. And this is why we decided at this moment to create the 50-liter Home Coalition, which is really a collaboration across the value chain of water to reinvent the innovation agenda on water and energy for urban living. And so this is really about system change innovation, and women will benefit actually even more than men, because we know that women are the water managers of the home, right? And we could have developed, and we are actually developing, water efficient products. We actually worked with the women in Cape Town to develop a line of hair care product that use no water. We call it waterless. But really, to make the 50-liter home a reality at the speed and scale that is needed, we need system-wide collaboration. We need to collaborate across sectors, across the value chain, with government and with municipalities. So that's one of the examples where intersection of leadership, climate, and system-wide innovation.
Chris, why don't you weigh in on that same question, really looking at how your sector and company has played a leadership role. But before you do that, I want to just say we may be having a reverberation in the sound. So if you are, we're trying to fix that. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Very excited to be here with all of you today talking about this important topic. So Mondelez International, we're one of the world's biggest snack companies, and our mission is empowering people to snack right. And we know that people don't want to have to make a choice between eating the snacks that they love and eating right. And part of right means making snacks the right way so that people and planet thrive. So that's what we're working on and focused on in our sustainability area. And climate change for us is our #1 priority within sustainability. And when we look at our environmental footprint, it's different than P&G's. 60% of our CO2 emissions come from our sustainable ingredients that we grow. And so to tackle that, we've set science-based targets, and we have some signature programs like Cocoa Life, where our approach is to tackle the root causes to help drive systemic change and lasting change. And so Cocoa Life is a program where we're one of the world's largest buyers of cocoa. We have a 10-year, $400 million program. We're in the 7th year of it. We're currently, as of the end of last year, sourcing 63% of our cocoa for our chocolate. We're one of the world's largest chocolate companies. So 63% through the program. And for us, gender equality has always been a cross-cutting theme within Cocoa Life. And what that means is, as we look at farming training, as we look at community empowerment, as some of the things that we need to do to drive that systemic change, women are pervasive in terms of the lens that we use as we think about that, because women play such a critical role in cocoa farming, in the cocoa industry, and they're often overlooked. So with the change that we've been driving and really championing within the sector is to help bring that information and data about women and the pivotal role they play, help insist, as we work with all of our partners, that we put a spotlight on women and make sure that we're reaching them. And really to help be that voice to drive change. No one company on any of these issues is going to be able to achieve it alone. So really looking at partnerships as being key with governments, stakeholders, other companies, et cetera, as the way to really ensure that it's a real true transformation and that women are included in that effort.
Yeah, and I know, we can come back to this, I think, maybe when we get to the questions. I know both of your companies are very active in corporate social responsibility, but also, as you've discussed, this is not really just about social responsibility and good citizenship, it's about good business practice. And so I think that's so important to point that out, that this is not something you sort of do on the side as a company, but that it's part of it's really embedded into your business practices and supply chains if you really want to see the impact, both for your company, but for the environment and for sustainability. So I hope maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later and how you learn from each other as well in terms of what practices are really the most effective. So Natalie, I want to turn to you. You're obviously in a different sector. You're an investor, you're an entrepreneur yourself. So how do you answer that question?
First of all, thank you for having me. I feel like snacking, especially during the current pandemic, is particularly important for all of us. From my perspective, I am known for investing with a gender lens. And for a long time, that was very much my focus. Obviously, I wrote a book supporting women entrepreneurs. And much like intersectional feminism, where that inextricable connection between things like race and gender is impossible to divorce, I think that the same thing came to be true for me with gender and climate. I am a failed environmental engineer who went to the dark side and became a software engineer during the dot-com boom. And the rest is history. And I focus on things like reproductive health, making sure that women have access to affordable things like, for example, the birth control pill, which has absolutely no business being by prescription. These were my areas of focus, and it was through a project that I worked on last year, helping a dear colleague of mine, Ibrahim Al-Husseini, stand up a climate fund called Full Cycle, that I really went back to my roots as an environmental engineer. And it was via Full Cycle and also the amazing research by Dr. Catherine Wilkinson at Project Drawdown that I learned that climate and gender, as you said in your opening remarks, can't really be disconnected. And in fact, women are the key in many, many respects to creating the sort of reversal and improvement and hopefully systematic change that we need to see to really address the climate crisis. And so for me, that learning is new. And one of the things that is probably the newest for me is to realize that, 20 years ago, when I was working in the world of environmental engineering, there was a lot to learn. There were technologies to be created. That isn't the case today. Today, as an investor, what I see and what I learned, for example, with Full Cycle is now is really better than new, right? The data shows that we don't have a lot of time. We don't have 10, 15, 20 years for new technology to develop and to evolve and then to be commercialized. What we need to do is we need to be investing in technologies that are available right now to expand, to turn into the newest leading commercial products and monster companies of the world that are hopefully, like the co-panelists that I have here with me, going to be moving the dial, not in the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, but right now. And I think that if you don't understand that women are a key part and that the data clearly shows that women are a key part of moving that dial, then you're really getting the systemic change equation wrong. And that's what is influencing a lot of my investing and my work again, now at the intersection of climate and gender, which is the new thesis for me.
Mm-hmm. And I think I want to come back to that later about really how you think about that intersection and what specifically you're looking for when you're investing in those types of innovations and those types of, you know, innovators. So, but I want to go back to both Virginie and Chris and focus on sort of how do you get this done at big companies? You both work for very large institutions and, you know, have done amazing things and are really leaders, obviously, in both the gender equality and sustainability spaces. But Virginie, I'm going to start with you. I mean, what have you seen that's the most effective to really help you move this forward? This is, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say, you know, institutional change is not easy. And I think oftentimes it looks easy from the outside, or easier from the outside than it really ever is. So what has been effective in your experience to really convince people of the importance of this linkage and of this work internally? How have you done that effectively? And also, I know, how have you used data specifically? Because I think that's also part of this equation is the data that we have and how we use it in a really positive way. So I'm going to start with you on that, and then I'll move to Chris.
Yes, you said it, Stephanie. It's about change management, and you may remember this book, Switch, where the author used the metaphor of a rider, which is the rational system in an organization, driving an elephant, which is the emotional and the political system. And so for change to happen, you need three things. You need to direct the rider, motivate the elephant, and shape the path. And what I've noticed is that actually those three things are critical, and there are several tactics that you can activate. So to direct the rider, you need to point to a compelling destination. For us, we call it Ambition 2030. It is our roadmap, you know, to enable positive impact. But you also need to script the critical moves, because business leader would say, this is such a daunting task, you know, where do I start? And for us, we also always say, you start with science. You start with a life cycle analysis, which tells you where you can have the greatest impact. And then you need to motivate the elephant. So finding the motivation, you know, and the motivation can be, I want to leave a legacy for my grandchildren. Or it can be, I want to grow my market share. And whatever that is, you know, I take it. And you need to accept that you won't get 100% of the leaders. Actually, when I started in the job, I called it my 1%. It was kind of the coalition of the willing. And that is enough, you know, to get the movement going. But then you need to shrink the change. You know, you need to de-risk the project like you do in finance. You know, you need to start with pilots. One of our most successful pilots was this Head and Shoulders bottle made with beach plastic. It was 3 years ago, way before the ocean plastic pollution issue was mainstream. And that internally had a huge impact, because people realized that they could have a great value-creating business proposition and at the same time reduce their footprint and create awareness on the issue. And so from that point, you know, many pilots started and that created a business case. And last, you need to shape the path. That is when you need to make it systemic. It's not enough anymore to make it voluntary, to rely on 1%. You need to integrate it in your processes, innovation process, brand building, and culture. And this is a top-down approach. And you need to make it the norm, you know, like you rally the herd, you know, the elephants look to the herd, you know, to find cues on how to behave. And that's the same internally. You need also to leverage a bit of internal competition, you know, when all boats rise, when that happens. So that's really, you know, kind of tactics on how to make it happen. And another interesting thing is you actually bring the outside in to get, because that's one thing when I say things internally, that's a completely different thing when other people, experts, you know, say it. And Clover Hogan, who spoke on this forum this morning, was one of our advisors, you know, advising our C-suite and our leaders on how to advance and how to be a leader on this space. which brings me to data. I mentioned data a little bit because we always start with data. You know, the life cycle analysis is the backbone of all our strategies. And our Ambition 2030 have goals across supply chain, brands, employees, partnership, and they are internally binding. You know, our business leaders are accountable for it. But we also take that beyond our four walls to our supply chain. And we measure everything. You know, we know that you get what you measure, and we have a sustainability supplier scorecard. We've started to track actually our spend with suppliers who have a female CEO. We want to encourage that behavior and increase that spend with women-owned business.
That's great. And I think you touched on so many things that are so important. I love the elephant there in the road and all that, the compelling destination. But I do think one commonality really from what you're saying and what we heard this morning, and Natalie talked about a little bit, is that, you know, this work that you do internally does not happen in a vacuum, that outside forces have a huge impact on the work and the supply chain and how you manage that. And I think, Chris, really turning to you, I mean, again, I'm curious from your perspective, like what has been the most effective for you to move this ball forward at Mondelez, but also maybe specifically to talk about your supply chains, because you obviously, and you mentioned this, are very, you know, the cocoa supply chain that's so important to all of us every day in our chocolate eating. But really, I know you focused a lot on women in the supply chain and how to really make those supply chains sustainable and open to, and open, so there's more access to them. So if you could talk about those two things and really, again, how you've moved the ball forward and really supply chain issues on gender and ensuring that women have access to those supply chains.
Sure, thanks. I'd be happy to. So we, where we started is, first of all, making the business case. So as you said, you know, we are a big chocolate company, and cocoa is an essential ingredient. And so when you start just analyzing, okay, so what do we need to make sure that this is a business strategy? So we want to have a robust, growing business for a chocolate business for the foreseeable future. That means we need a steady supply of cocoa. And when we dug into the issues and started to understand some of the vulnerabilities and how interconnected the issues were, that also led us to understand the importance of women. And we similarly, we went out and got the facts to inform our business case and what our strategy should be to ensure that we did have a strong supply of cocoa for the future. And what we saw is, in fact, women were so invisible. They were doing 40% of the work in cocoa farming, 40%, and yet they often went unrecognized. There was a significant pay discrepancy. We saw so Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are two countries where they produce about 70% of the world's cocoa, and what we found was a significant pay gap in Cote d'Ivoire up to 70%. We also saw that while women were doing 40% of the work, they owned about 2% of the land. And so the way that the whole access in the supply chain works to training, to financing for farming inputs, to things like fertilizer, new planting materials, all of that was really focused on the men, because it's deemed, let's invite the people who own the farms to the training, not necessarily people who are doing the work. So back to the business case, you know, we want to help ensure we have a robust supply of cocoa. From a climate perspective, we want to help farmers grow more cocoa on less land, right, to help to mitigate and curtail deforestation. And yet the people who are doing that, the work on the farms, weren't receiving any of the input. So our outreach with our suppliers is, we've got to change this. And it was all about the business case. We're investing a lot of money and resources. Our supplier partners are investing a lot of money and resources. And, you know, we weren't necessarily seeing the kinds of productivity results that we were hoping for. And now we understand part of the reason why when you uncover it. And I think the other thing that's been interesting is that it's a pretty male-dominated in industry. I think like the way many agricultural commodities are, from what I've seen. And I serve on the World Cocoa Foundation board, and I'm one of the few women there. But I think continuing to have the voice, within our own Cocoa Life program, we have women, myself, sort of in the corporate level, all the way down to folks who are running our programs in the origins in our different origin countries are female. So having that, the lens, the voice to continue to be a reminder about the business case. And so what we've done is then say, okay, so we need some interventions to change this. And as I said earlier, make gender just a lens through which we do everything. So we started doing farmer training and doing it to make sure that we required our suppliers to have women be trained. And then it's not just a matter of putting quotas out there, but it's the how you do it, because there's a lot of cultural norms that also need to be tackled to truly get at women's empowerment. And so having women train other women, having women, groups, community groups, farmer training groups come together at times of the day that are good for women, because they also have a lot of other responsibilities in addition to the work that they do on the farms. And so getting it at a time and location that would work for them. Some of those subtleties are really important to really cracking the code. The other piece is financing, and you talked about that a bit, Natalie. So we've now got, we've been working for years on village savings and loan associations. In the last 2 years, we've doubled those. Now we have over 121,000 community members. We work in about 2,000 communities around the world. We have about 121,000 members. Over 70% are women. So what we've done lately is we see very much this green and pink connection. So we're trying to tackle climate change and help women have other livelihoods. We've just completed a successful pilot where we had those VSLAs. We hook them up and help them start 3 nurseries within Cote d'Ivoire. So we gave them seedling materials, we gave them training on, how do you help to nurture the trees within the nursery. These trees are often, they're a combination of, they provide immediate some access to food crops, and they provide shade for the cocoa trees, which helps to combat some of the climate impact that we're seeing, the stresses in cocoa. And then the women have these seedlings, and they're able to sell them, so they have an income stream, and then that comes, the resources come back into their community of village and savings and loans. So we've seen this beautiful virtuous cycle of innovation. So I guess that would be my other thing is, working with your suppliers or your partners in your supply chain, and thinking about, how can we connect women as change agents, because they are, to drive communities to be stronger and better, to drive more livelihoods for themselves and their families, to drive and directly tackle things like climate change, because we know women are often disproportionately, we see, directly affected in places around the world by the effects of climate change and access that it gives them to food security and things like that. So, yeah.
Great. Well, that's great. Then that's a perfect, really segue. I have a question for Natalie, but some of the questions coming in are really just perfect, sort of a perfect synergy. We have a lot of questions around investments and how, the importance of investing in women and women-owned businesses, whether it's in the supply chain or more generally, in a larger way. So, Natalie, you talked a little bit about the full cycle fund, and really weaving in these questions we've been getting from the audience. I maybe like you to talk about how you've brought that together, how you've seen the gender and climate nexus, as you said, kind of in a new way, and really how you see also individuals, how individuals can think about investing and in a fund like yours, or more broadly, in a way that really has a positive impact, because I think we're getting questions from the audience around that issue as well. So if you could address all those topics in a couple of minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Everything I touch, whether it's advising, a fund like Full Cycle that's focused really singularly on climate in a really innovative way, or in my own investing, the one thing that I would say is I would advocate for a holistic view of what gender lens really means, right? I think that if you Google today, gender lens investing, or as Suzanne Beagle, who is an incredible scholar and a leader in the space, calls it gender smart investing, you see a whole lot. In fact, I would say most of the oxygen taken up by this idea that the thesis involves women-led or women-owned businesses. And that is a really critical piece, because I think, as my fellow panelists are talking about, there is a lot that can be done in a top-down approach. And that's how systemic change often begins, but it isn't the only way. And what I want to encourage people to realize is that gender lens investing, or investing with women in mind, involves looking outside of just the corner office, right? It involves not just looking at businesses that are led by women or businesses that are owned by women, but it also involves looking at I would say 99% of the rest of the women who may never be in a corner office, who may never be in the C-suite, who work in factories, who are these smallholder farmers that Chris was just talking about. And so really thinking about gender lens from the perspective of, where is every dollar going? How is this business that I'm supporting, be it as an investor or simply as a consumer, because that's ultimately an investment. Every dollar we spend is an investment. How is it impacting women at every step of the way? Not just are there X number of women in the C-suite, right? And I think that if we look at it holistically, a lot of other things start to become uncovered. And to your question about what we as individuals can do, whether you are at the level of institutional capital and controlling billions of dollars, or you are at the level of, you graduated from a university that has an endowment. My alma mater, Columbia University, has over $10 billion in their endowment. Or you have a 401k, or you have a pension, or you have other ways of influencing capital, even though they might just be, I went to a college, right? And the way that an individual can really make an impact here is to realize that less than 2% of global capital is managed by women or people of color combined. So I can tell you right now that when you pick up the phone and you ask your college or university who is managing that endowment, when you pick up the phone and you find out who is managing your pension fund, your 401k, your retirement, I will tell you a preview to the end of that movie, it's going to be a disappointing answer. And unless the number is 51%, which is the global population of women, or the fact that, people of color represent the majority of the global population, if the majority of the people managing that money are not what the world looks like, then you have something to say. You have a complaint to file. You have a demand to make. And I think that every individual has that ability to do that. And if we make noise about the fact that less than 2% of global capital is managed by people who look like us, then I think that we'll start to see that lever move. And that is how investors like myself get called and get told, Natalie, what do we do about investing in women? What do we do about bringing more people of color into these systems? And unless the demand is there, the lever really won't move.
Well, and I think that's a really interesting point. And I know in the discussions that we had ahead of time, and then in some of the questions as well, a lot of it comes down to how we view women, right? Do we view women as sort of victims of in this case, climate change or COVID, or do we view women as leaders and drivers of change? So one question that's come in through the chat, which I'd love to have each of you comment on briefly before we get to our last question. So unexpected question, but I think it's a good one, is from your perspective, how do we change that narrative? What can we do to stop people or from thinking only about women as sort of receiving all the bad that comes from these crises and problems, and instead being drivers of change? So just to mix it up, maybe I'll start with Chris on that, and then go to Natalie and Virginie. Just what can people do to think about helping to change that narrative?
Right. I think it starts by just recognizing, as we've seen multiple examples here, that women are change agents, and just helping to give them some of the tools. First of all, I think it's even being aware of the fact that women don't have access always to the tools and to as you're saying, Natalie, to capital, to having a voice. The other thing that we see is that, it's a matter of also trying to help it takes like a little bit of a spark, and then women kind of just take it from there. So helping women to find their voice and to help each other. I think that's another terrific thing that we see on the ground, is the networks of women who come in and really learn to support each other, and to stand tall and be brave and push for resources. And what we see is that women are often more likely to invest smartly and to make decisions that benefit their household, their children, and their community in really transformative ways. So that's why, this is not about making women feel good or, giving them a voice just so that they have a voice. This is very much, if we want to drive to tackle these systemic problems, we need to see that women are going to, be just a catalyst for good. They're just a great investment and catalyst for real change.
That's my favorite question. So I would say
did you plant that question?
I have a few people in the audience, perhaps.
Okay.
I think that first of all, I agree with everything that Chris said. Incredible work that has to be done among the population of people who see women as leaders, as well as, building that leadership muscle. I would say, though, in addition to that, that for the folks that are shaping where we invest and where priorities are created, I would say this: the data is really clear, right? Whether it's investing in women-led businesses, whether it is investing in a supply chain that supports women, as Chris just mentioned, the work that Procter & Gamble does is also a great example there. Whether it is women on boards, there is a study, actuarial data, that says that women over the age of 50, for example, are twice as likely to be successful as entrepreneurs. If the folks who have a fiduciary duty in many cases to deliver shareholder value, whether it be in large corporations or even in the private startup world, if they actually followed what the data said, places like Silicon Valley would be swimming in women over the age of 50. And for those of us that have been to Silicon Valley anytime in the last 20 years, that is not the case. And so, the same thing, boards would be swimming with women. If the true fiduciary duty was honored and enforced, and we followed the data that very clearly says that we are leaving money on the table, those of us that have a fiduciary duty to deliver shareholder value, if that was enforced, then I think that we would be in a very different place. The data very clearly shows that if you want to return investment, if you want to return results, you need to be inclusive of the other 51% of the population. We're not doing that. And I think more so than something that involves social justice or diversity and inclusion, it is a bottom line imperative. And I don't think that it's framed that way often enough, and it really needs to be. So I guess the short version of that is do your fiduciary duty and listen to the data.
Okay, great. Virginie, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, just one thing, because so much has been said already, but I agree that the facts are there and they should be the basis for the new narrative. One fact that is absolutely amazing, like very recent one, is the correlation that we've seen between women's head of state and their effectiveness in handling COVID. New Zealand, Germany, Taiwan, Finland, and that shows that female leadership is so suited for tackling the big planetary challenges, because they have a holistic system view of things, because they are better at collaborating, because they have more empathy and compassion, probably. But that's what's needed to tackle the big challenges of today.
And that's a perfect segue for our last question. We're coming right to the end here. We're obviously here to talk about a call to action for the G7. And so one thing I'm going to ask each of you is, what is one thing you would implore, demand, ask of the G7 leaders when they meet next month around this issue of women's leadership and climate? So I will start with Natalie and then go to Virginie and then give Chris the last word on this. So just one thing. Natalie, you're first.
Sure. Coming from the perspective of an investor, it's very simple to me. I think that when you look at the leadership of my colleagues, right? When you look at Chris, when you look at Virginie, you see that women lead differently. And what we need is for companies worldwide to make a commitment to ensure that anything to do with the finances of your business all the way down the supply chain is managed by a proportion that is reflective of the world. Women represent 51% of the world. They should represent 51% of the people holding the purse strings.
Right. Virginie.
So I would say it is time for a new concerted push behind the SDGs, and all of the SDGs are important. But I would have a plea to double down on 5 of them. SDG 5, gender equality, 13, climate action, 12, responsible consumption, 17, partnership, and 3, health. And by the way, if you add them all up, it makes 50. So it is our compass for 2050, and it should be starting today.
Okay, thank you. Chris.
I would ask that they value monetarily the work that women do across various sectors and factor that into the green recovery equation and make some of the recovery money and incentives that will go back in be conditional about, to the equation of women's work and the worth of women's work being part of the equation that receives a proportion of the resources.
Well, that's great. And I'm being given the high sign, even virtually that happens, by the way, to all of you out there. So I want to thank the 3 of you for really, I could go on in this conversation for a really long time. I have all these things I'd love to talk to you about, and I know the audience feels the same way. You are all great examples of leaders who happen to be women, really addressing these critically important topics. And so I want to thank you on behalf of I think the audience and on my own behalf and on behalf of the Women's Forum for just being great participants and really adding such value to this discussion. I will turn it back over, I believe, to Julian and for the next session. So thank you all so much.